And go. Hi, everybody. Welcome to another episode of Continuous Discussions, the online forum where we talk about Agile, DevOps, and continuous delivery. I'm Sam Fell.
And I'm Anders Wahlgren. And today, once again, we've got Gene Kim and the programming committee from the DOES 2018 conference, and a bunch of the speakers as well. There's a little bit of intersection there, of course. And we're going to have a chat with them today with Gene Kim. So let's do that. That sounds like fun.
Awesome. Hey, thank you so much, Sam and Anders. Oh, Sam, did I step on you here?
Nope. All you, Gene. Go for it.
Oh, yeah. In fact, okay, great. Well, I have the privilege of helping run the DevOps Enterprise Summit, aided by an incredible programming committee, of which we have two attending, actually three, and a special honored guest and friend, Tom Limoncelli. So why don't we go do round-robin introductions? Cornelia, let's start with you. Could you do a brief introduction of yourself, name, role, and what you'll be presenting on at DevOps Enterprise?
You bet. So my name is Cornelia Davis. I work for Pivotal. I have been at Pivotal for about 5 years, and by background, I'm a developer. But when I started working on this application platform about 5 years ago that is called Cloud Foundry, I realized very quickly that in order to use modern platforms, it really wasn't just a developer gain, it was also an operations gain. So I've become very much a DevOps person. I have had the honor of working with Gene now on the DevOps Enterprise Summit for roughly 3 years or so. I think I missed the first year. And am delighted for this year's program for a couple of reasons. Number one, I'm delighted that we're in Vegas, believe it or not. I think just the change in venue signifies maybe an opportunity for change. And I'm very, very excited about the program this year because of more of an ops focus. So my personal background, I think we're seeing something similar happening at DevOps Enterprise. And I'm also very much looking forward to getting some more kind of really concrete technical talks in the conference as well.
Awesome. Thank you, Cornelia. And by the way, we'll be talking a little bit more about your talk later. But it's funny you mentioned that you now self-identify almost as much as an ops person as a developer, where I've actually kind of flipped, right? It was like I said for decades, self-identified as a developer, operations. And then in the last couple of years, I think I now self-identify more as a developer. So with that, thanks, Cornelia. Damon, please introduce yourself.
Yeah, hi, I'm Damon Edwards. Spent many years as a consultant, kind of traveling the world, helping organizations with a trusted team of colleagues, really kind of focusing on the DevOps conundrum that many large enterprises are facing, but kind of coming at it from the ops towards dev perspective, rather than I think the traditional dev towards ops perspective. So, got to see inside a lot of large organizations, some high flyers, some not so much. And that really kind of colored my worldview and led me to some of my colleagues co-found Rundeck, which has been a successful open source project for a while, focusing on kind of enabling operations as a service inside organizations. But, really kind of came on strong as a commercial opportunity in the last couple of years. So focused all my time on that. And got involved with the DevOps Enterprise Summit from the earliest days. Actually, I think I can take credit for being one of the two people that actually introduced Gene to the entire DevOps idea. I begged him to come to our first DevOps days in the U.S. in Mountain View, and he couldn't believe people had read his book and Visible Ops and wanted to hang out with him. So, but he found his tribe, and also John Willis kind of put the screws to him and really made sure he got on board. So I guess I got some responsibility for that. And I'm most excited about DevOps Enterprise Summit because I think it's a unique group of practitioners, senior, middle to senior leaders, from around the globe, talking about their problems and what they're doing to build higher velocity organizations. And to echo what Cornelia said, I'm really excited about the kind of heavier operations focus and also some of the more interesting, deeper technical talks like Cornelia's talk in London. And then I think she's going to do something similar in San Francisco.
Brilliant. Thank you, Damon. So, hey, Tom, you spoke to the DevOps Enterprise Summit before. We all admire and revere your books. So yeah, introduce yourself and tell us about what you'll be presenting at DevOps Enterprise this year.
Thanks. My name's Tom Limoncelli. I'm the manager of the SRE team at StackOverflow.com, which hopefully is the website all of your developers use to solve all their problems. My background is in operations and traditional system administration, but I was always the person that was automating things and doing things a little bit differently. And about 10 years ago, people said, "Hey, Tom, there's now a word for what you're doing. It's called DevOps." And I was like, "What? That's a terrible name." And actually, I can tell you more funny stories about that later. But so about 2 years ago, I spoke at DevOps Enterprise Summit for my first time. I loved it. I loved the fact that I got to interact with so many people that were the change agents at the manager and executive level, which as an engineer is not something that I always get to do. The talk I'm going to be giving this year is on so people talk a lot about making the DevOps transformation on the developer side. I'm going to talk about some techniques I've used to make that transition on the operations side. It can be very difficult to tell people to change the way they do their operations. It's like telling someone that they have an ugly baby, and you don't want to do that. So I have a couple tricks, and I'd say psychological or management tricks for making big changes within operations teams.
Brilliant. And man, we're so great. We even have like a whole programming around you that of like-minded spirits as well. So Mick, same thing. Introduce yourself and tell us what you'll be presenting on in Vegas.
Yes, so my name is Mick Kirsten. I'm the founder and CEO of TaskTop, and my background is a lot of open source development. So for me, because it was really all around making multiple open source projects successful, the deployment aspect of things was always key in the entire delivery pipeline. And when I was working closely with Rod Johnson at that time of SpringSource and onto VMware, and sort of co-evolving with some of the pivotal tooling and Cloud Foundry, we realized there was this massive bottleneck between the way that developers were writing applications and the way they were shipping them. And so this initiative called Code to Cloud as an experiment. And since that point, we realized that connecting both the infrastructure architecture, just the complexiness and messiness of the runtimes and both private and public clouds was going to become one of the main productivity gains for the end-to-end value streams, not just developers coding user features and pushing code. So I think it's great that we've got this track to kind of connect both sides, right? Gene, you coming from the ops side, some of us coming from the dev side, to look at how we take some of the programming concepts and apply them to what infrastructure should look like. And from myself, in terms of the talk I'll be giving at the conference, it's really around this new book I've written called Project to Product, and how we need to create these value stream networks that focus on delivering end-to-end business value, not over-focused on the development side, on the agile side, or on other silos like operations, but really on how we remove friction and focus on flow end-to-end, which I think this track is going to be an absolute critical part of. So.
And I think it's an amazing book. I think it's going to be a very important book for the next generation of technology leaders. And Anders, please introduce yourself and anything specific that you're excited about for the programming this year. Anders?
There we go. Yeah, sorry, I had a little bit of trouble unmuting myself there. Yeah, no, we've got a bunch of interesting things we're going to talk about this year as well. But really, I think we should focus on the plenary speakers, I think, today. But we'll have lots of stuff to talk about with Electric Cloud and Electric Flow and all of our stuff as well. So we definitely look forward to that. And this is by far my favorite conference, and I know I'm biased, but it is absolutely a joy to be a part of.
Well, awesome. In fact, I think one of the things that maybe just in terms of a brief background, we've talked a little bit about before this next generation operations infrastructure track, and it really came out of maybe the trivialize it a little bit, but it's actually some of the most powerful pieces of feedback I've gotten about the conference, which was for 4 years in a row, Jason Cox, the Director of Systems Engineering at Disney, said, great conference, especially as part of the program committee, a great conference for developers, not as good for operations. And he said that, 4 years in a row, and for 4 years in a row, I always told him, okay, we'll do better next time. And so after the fourth time hearing that, we decided to do something different, and we specifically reserved 25% of the talks around next generation operations concerns. And we did it for the first time in London, and I view this as a multi-year program where our goal is to really surface what problems are being faced by traditional operations organizations, steeped in traditional orthodoxy, and more importantly, what are the new revolutionary things that are being done differently, and specifically, what are the principles that people are using to sort of frame all of these, new practices. So I think the feedback, especially among the program community, is that we're all delighted by the way it sort of reshaped the conference. It added a totally different tone to the conference. So one thing I'd just love to discuss briefly is from each one of you is, what are the things that you think are unaddressed in the current discussions around operations? Damon, you've been one of those vocal advocates of this. Why don't we start with you?
Sure. I think if you think about what's going on the operations side of the house, there's two major things. One is that the entire landscape is changing. Like, so there's great retooling is happening when it comes to, architectures, underlying platforms, networks, right? Everything's becoming this, cloud native, right? Which meant it went from virtualization to virtualization that somebody else could run for you to now, this containerization and the microservices and all that comes with that. So we've got this opportunity for incredible sort of flexibility and speed, right? But then at the same time, operations is kind of squeezed between what's going on the development side of the house, which is these agile DevOps transformations, go, open things up. And at the same time, the business is cracking down saying, whoa, this is our means of production, right? Don't be the next hack. Don't be the next breach, keep us out of the news, lock things down, right? So ops is being squeezed between these two forces, and then they're trying to process all this new technology at the same time. So it's a very difficult place to be, but it's also very exciting. And if you look at a lot of the kind of high flying operations organizations out there, they just started in the last decade, right? They were able to purpose build their organization for this kind of velocity and flexibility and sort of decoupled way of working. But in the enterprise, they've got 20, 30 years of success, right? They got all these legacy platforms, legacy tools, legacy technologies, legacy people, legacy skills, and all kinds of different generations within those different legacy areas. So for enterprise operations, it's you have to kind of rethink fundamentally, the conventional wisdom of how you think about and approach and do operations work. So I think this is a great, I think like this conference was in the early days of kind of the DevOps explosion, I think this will be great for the kind of operations transformation that's going on now, because this is distinctly an enterprise discussion, because it's all about that history of success that we have to account for. And
Damon, there's something specific that, like, there are talks that we do not include, right? Because specifically it's about the just around the release continuous delivery pipeline, right? It's like I think we understand that pattern, right? And so for this next generation operations tracking, we're specifically looking at things that aren't that, the other novel techniques that people are using.
It's what happens after deployment, right? Because that really is operations. But then also, how do you do this stuff at scale? That and it's organizational complexity and scale, right? Not just infrastructure complexity and scale. That's a solved problem. Dealing with organizational scale, and how do you do this? Much like the reason for this conference for the entire DevOps movement in the first place, right? It's when you're a purpose-built organization, or you're only a couple hundred people sitting around an all-hands meeting, you just stop doing what you used to do, right? It's not as difficult, straightforward. If you're a multi-business line, multi-generational, multi-thousand of people in multiple countries, it's a lot more difficult problem to solve. And I think this conference is attacking that head on, right? For those people.
Yeah. And by the way, I think that was a kind of a programming challenge. Is like, if you eliminate the release automation, continuous deployment stories, it really forced us to surface the other problems that are, existential challenges to these, traditional ops organizations. Cornelia, how about you? What are your what excited you about the programming objectives around next generation ops?
So there's a couple of things. I mean, when I reflect upon the course that DevOps Enterprise has taken and where it has helped people really become very successful on the dev side of DevOps. And I think about what are those elements. You just mentioned some of them yourself, Gene. Things around continuous delivery pipelines, things like short iterations, small batch sizes, you build it, you run it, kind of that continuous evolution. And yet on the ops side, and especially if we look at it from an infrastructure perspective, some of those things still don't exist. And when I speak with a lot of our clients, and I speak with the IT operations folks, and they're still largely short order cooks. They're very reactive. They're just doing the things that people need to do. So it's being able to apply some of those same principles to the way that you do ops. Now, at the core of that, I believe, is this philosophical notion that people still have a hard time wrapping their arms around, which is to treat platform just like you treat any other product. And when I say platform, I mean, instead of treating it as an infrastructure, provide a platform, a productized platform, whatever that may be, whether it's a combination of your Git for GitOps, or it is a combination of Git and your Jenkins and your runtime environment, be it Kubernetes or something like that. It's really thinking of that as a product. And that's what I'm excited about, is especially when I hear Tom in his intro say, hey, his kind of definition of DevOps is, I'm an operations person, but I'm treating it like a developer. I'm doing continuous delivery, and I'm doing pipelines, and I'm checking things into Git. That's the thing that I think that we haven't gotten the groundswell quite yet. And I'm excited to see that evolve.
And we'll talk a little bit later in terms of, I think all of the, if we just follow the course of what the development languages and development frameworks have done for developer productivity and extend that to operations. I mean, I think the best time for operations infrastructure and platforms are to come. And I'm super excited about some of the insights that you're predicting. Mick, how about you? In terms of unmet needs around operations and infrastructure?
Yeah, I think the key thing is what you said, Gene, right? Is that a lot of the people I speak to, they considering CI/CD a solved problem, right? Or at least in the point, not necessarily that they've solved it and scaled it internally, because that'd probably be overstating it, but in the sense that either they or their teams understand it enough and are on a trajectory, and basically where the leaders of those teams are wondering what the next bottleneck is, and are absolutely scrambling with trying to figure out how their world is changing, as whether they go to more public cloud, more private cloud, or whatever they do with their data centers. So I think Damon hit a really key thing for me about the importance of this program, and then just this discussion within the DevOps Enterprise community, which is, how do you organizationally, what does this mean, right? One of the fact that I so often see the development side of the organization and the infrastructure operations side is just completely different metrics and telemetry, right? One side from the just sort of more the more familiar telemetry that we have from DevOps, and the other side just still in sort of burn up, burn down worlds, and there is not a common metrics or language for what really should be an end-to-end value stream. The fact that feature teams are a great unit, but really, do we need to align more around end-to-end product? The really big thing is these product-oriented value streams that we absolutely see the tech giants aligned around. And why do we not see those organizational structures in our companies today? And then what can we learn from the speakers in this track in terms of how we set up enterprise IT organizations more like that? And then, so that's kind of the more organizational side, again, organizing around products and value streams. I think that the other big thing for me that I think we see these winning organizations doing, whether they're startups or unicorns or tech giants, is what Cornelia said, which is treating the platform as product, right? Which to me is really treating the value stream network, the thing that you're delivering value to your users, and be they internal or external users, as a product itself. Just the sheer investment that you see within tech giants in those platforms, in what it takes to not just make developers productive, but when you look at how much Google's invested in scaling testing, scaling infrastructure, but done it holistically, right? Not siloed. I think there's this big opportunity to connect the conversation at a technical level, because in the end, it needs to be one platform that supports your value streams, and not this next generation just infrastructure pieces, just deployment destination and PaaS pieces. So I think the super important thread of having an end-to-end platform for development, all the way from design and ideation and business strategy to running software, and the people that need to be empowered as the ones working on building out that product, that platform end to end. So.
And Mick, to get concrete, right? The numbers around when we talk about Google, 1,500 people focused on dev productivity at Google, and I think 5,000 people at Microsoft.
3,500, yeah.
3,500.
The developer division at Microsoft, right? Is now most of our audience probably won't be able to staff, find $500 million in the couch cushions tomorrow to staff that up, but it's a great indication of how seriously, how invested the tech giants are in their own platform as products. If we don't at least adopt their thinking around having this connected end-to-end platform that supports all of your products and value streams, you're just not on the right path, right? CI/CD is a critical component, but again, I think that's why this track is so important, is thinking about that end-to-end platform from a technical and then an organizational point of view.
Cornelia, you had some thoughts on that, and then we'll get to Tom.
Yeah, so it was the comment, Mick, that you made where you said CI/CD is a solved problem, and I just wanted to go back, and at the risk of beating a dead horse, and say CI/CD is a solved problem at this layer, at the application layer that we're creating to create consumer value. It is absolutely not a solved problem at the kind of infrastructure and operations level, the provisioning level. I was just on a call this morning where somebody was saying, oh yeah, we were working with a partner, it was a storage partner, and they had delivered kind of a flow of here's what you'll do when you want to do this provisioning of this storage volume against Kubernetes. And it was very, you have to go in here and you have to create a DNS entry there and you have to drop certificates here. And there was no automation around that. And so CI/CD, and I realize that continuous integration and continuous delivery is a little bit tangential to pipelines, but they definitely intersect. And so it's a solved problem at the dev layer. It's not a solved problem at the ops layer.
Oh boy, that's like Tom, you have experience in problems like this.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, a vendor that doesn't provide an API, I've never heard of that, Gene. Yeah, in fact, a lot of the projects I've been on have been to put an API around something that doesn't have an API so that it becomes programmable. But I think one of the big challenges is in traditional IT, you hire an additional engineer for every, so many, services or users or something, and that doesn't scale. The way to really scale your operations is to be able to have a fixed sized team that can manage the service no matter how large it grows, or maybe not need to hire until, thousands or millions of users or services or whatever you're counting. And that's a very different organizational structure. The other challenge is that with just like in the CI/CD transformations, where often you're getting a whole company to move on to a new set of tools, in operations, every operations team has a totally different way of doing things, different tools, and it can be a big challenge to get everyone on some unified tool system. There's legacy issues, there's just habit. I'm very interested in talking about how we can create create change around that. My favorite management example in literature is Tom Sawyer. Tom Sawyer at the fence saying, I bet you can't paint this fence as well as I can. And eventually, he gets everyone else to paint the fence for him. And that's a lesson that I try to embed in my organizational transformations. And, get one team to do it well, and then let people copy that success, but also do it in a way that it feels like everyone's just trying to, you're creating not peer pressure, but a cultural minimums and cultural ways of doing things, so that people are competing to make things better instead of being told you have to make this change.
In fact, didn't you have and Team Stack release a DNS as API DNS as code? It just seems very familiar, and seems like very, very. You have a pattern of doing things like that, right? Of turning things into an automatable unit.
I like to have things as code. So, Terraform, or I think the project you're referring to is something we created called DNS control, which lets you specify how you want DNS configured once in a text file that you can put into, Git and a CI/CD workflow, and then it pushes out the DNS changes for Route 53 and Bind and all the different DNS providers.
In a declarative way.
In a declarative way, and it's auditable. You can go back and say who made this change, 5 months ago, and it's in Git. It's just like source code. You can say who created this bug or who created this feature.
And Damon, it's something we were talking about in the program committee yesterday, and Mick, it's we see these examples like Tom building all these kind of amazing technologies, and what we're trying to uncover is like the why, right? What is it about the way they think? Well, how do they view their role that allows them that leads them to develop things like this, right? I mean, it's just for me, it is an unanswered question.
Well, I mean, I kind of think if we went back to the early DevOps conversations, even early Agile conversations, what would possess somebody to build something like a continuous delivery pipeline, right? I mean, I think I think Dev has had a head start here. I think, you're talking Agile since like 2001, it's been seeping into people's brains. So people have been thinking about how do we transform, how fundamentally do we develop and test, right? So now it just seems commonplace. Like, of course, you're going to have this, continuous delivery pipeline. It's like a gauntlet that's going to go through this automated code, and you're going to work in small batches, not big batches, and all these things, because they've had that lean thinking seeping in. And I think now this is operations catching up with that, applying lean thinking to how operations does its work, and kind of building the bridge from ops back towards dev. So I think it's that's just what it is. It's the same kind of lean thinking discipline that's now finally penetrating deep into operations and causing leaders to say, hey, wait a minute, how do we redraw how this all looks and works so we get the results that we want?
So in fact, and I think one of the talks I was just so delighted by, and I'm so looking forward to the next iteration of the talk, it was from Cornelia. So Cornelia, turns out she and I have, for you, it's been a multi-decade love. For me, it's just a multi-year love of functional programming. And maybe to introduce the topic, I think object-oriented programming, block-oriented programming, and then object-oriented programming, those really changed the landscape and how people thought about how we should develop code. Functional programming probably belongs up there, even though it's probably not as well known yet. And I think the conversation that you and I were having, you were describing how you got your all but dissertation PhD work on programming languages, and we shared a love of Lisp functional programming. And what we were talking about was that so many of these patterns, immutability, the desire for declarative programming versus imperative programming, we actually see that in infrastructure patterns now, whether it's Kubernetes. Tom just mentioned how a declarative DNS form, right? So they could, get to a desired state without looping. I think it is looking at the contributions that functional programming has made to development. I think we are seeing those contributions made for infrastructure and operations. Can you talk a little bit more about that? And it turns out, Mick, just so you know, like one of the things I just loved was we see patterns like aspect-oriented programming, which you did your PhD thesis on, dissertation on. You know, those are actually showing up too. Like sidecars and Kubernetes are a way to inject things across, across everywhere, or as across concerns. Cornelia, do you want to start us off on that?
Yeah, you bet. I like how you said not as well known yet.
Yes.
It's funny because functional programming has obviously been around for ages, and I'm a functional programmer at heart. And when I left the university, kind of begrudgingly went back into the industry, into this world where functional programming really didn't play much of a part. But I like the yet part because I believe that we're at a cusp where that's going to change. I mean, your own personal experience in having moved over in starting to program in Clojure, and actually, if you go out there and you look for jobs, you can actually find paying jobs now where you're doing functional programming.
By the way, according to Stack Overflow, Clojure programmers are the highest paid programmers.
Yeah, which is interesting because I believe that this is a tangential thing, but the way that we've been trained as computer scientists and as developers, we're trained first to think imperatively and to think sequentially. And so I think that Clojure programmers are probably the highest paid because there's so few of them, and it takes such a mind shift to move over into this functional thinking. But that's a tangential thing. In terms of, I believe that the yet part is very imminent, and particularly I think this is going to come perhaps even as much from the IT infrastructure and ops side as it is the developer side, because of the incredible uptake of Kubernetes. Because Kubernetes, if you will, is at its core a functional model. They do everything declaratively. They do everything with safety and idempotency in mind, which are some of the concepts that I talk about in my talk. So let me back up and tell everyone here a little bit about the talk that I did in London and an evolution of the talk that's going to happen in Vegas. So coming from that personal experience I learned iterative programming first, then I went to graduate school at Indiana University where we did everything in Scheme. And I became a functional programmer and really fell in love with that. I am now seeing that similar thing happening because of the advent of Kubernetes. And as you said, Gene, you and I were riffing on this. And so the talk is about saying, well, let's take a look at the values that functional programming bring to application development. What does something like immutability offer? It offers us the ability to eliminate more edge cases. It's almost like your programs become proofs because you're just creating these declarative statements that don't change any state. And so it allows compilers of functional languages to be able to effectively do correctness proofs to make sure that you don't have edge cases. So there's all these things that you can do on the development side. If we start to apply those things now over to the operations side, we receive similar benefits. So we can eliminate some of those edge cases when it comes to the way that infrastructure is provisioned and networked together and those types of things. And so it's a bit of a study on what are those primitives. And many of them are coming from Kubernetes and other environments as well, but that's probably the most well-known and popular. And it's studying those characteristics more from the operations sense. So that's
Mick, Tom, I saw you nodding. Which one of you want to go first? Tom, since you're unmuted.
Well, sure. Well, Cornelia, it's interesting, and I wonder if you have any comments on the fact that it feels like for decades everyone's functional programming has been this academic thing that has such potential, and now I feel like the word functional is still something that people don't want to say, but they love talking about idempotency and things. So maybe is that the secret, that we just have to talk about idempotency? And as a backdoor to getting people into functional programming?
Maybe. I mean, one of the things that's interesting is that a lot of times when people think about functional programming and they really haven't deeply understood functional programming, what they say is, oh, well, Java 8, that's functional because you can pass functions around. And that's kind of not the point. I mean, yes, functional programming treats functions as a first-class entity, but it's really where the sweet spot is around these things like declarative and immutability and those types of things. But the interesting thing is, and forgive me for getting a little academic and mathematical here, but the function, having function as a first-class citizen is absolutely essential for that, because you start to be able to create these functions very dynamically, and the functions now encapsulate the state. So instead of having state and then having side effects against a state, what we have is these functions encapsulate a sequence of changes that are going to generate a state. So there's a part of me that says, oh, but we have to call it functional because functions are the enablers of these things. But I'm also a pragmatist, so whatever works.
It is funny, right? That, I mean, it doesn't take very long, before you then talk about Haskell, another famous programming language, and now he's talking about monads and functors and things where I still have a very tentative grasp on what those things are. And I think Tom's mentioning there's a sort of limit of fashionability that comes. But it's a great observation, Tom. Mick, you had some comments as well.
Yeah, so I think I kind of like that. So two different ways.
And your video just turned off.
Oh.
I have it.
You have it? Okay. So I look at these kind of at two sides of this. One is what we're learning, and Cornelia spoke to this a bunch, what we're learning from programming language that is being adopted and needs to be adopted in terms of infrastructure. I think those were some really good points, like immutability and these concepts that have become core in some types of programming. I think the really interesting thing to me from the development side has always been in terms of how programming languages and models and frameworks and SDKs have been evolving around whatever the deployment currency is, right? So a while back, the deployment currency was the virtual machine, and it just made for some very messy programming. You can take that all the way where you've got this very, very coarse unit. I think some of the original vision with platform as a service and some of the stuff that Cloud Foundry was built on was to make the application the currency that developers program to and as a unit. And I think it's interesting. I think it's just been such a long road, and I think a really interesting discussion point, and I think some of what you touch on, Cornelia, is how that's evolving, right? Because for most developers, the reality today and for the coming years, and in terms of these infrastructure problems that are not solved in continuous delivery, is what it means from the programmer and infrastructure point of view when the currency of deployment is the container. But the good thing is I think there's a lot in how those are wired together and how that flows back into the way that we build these applications to be resilient or insulate developers from changes in IP addresses and DNSs and so on, as you were mentioning, Tom. So I think we're always going to have more innovation on this front, because you can go as far as saying, okay, the currency is actually the function, and Amazon Lambda literally does that, right? It's doable, but I think it's just going to be a super interesting discussion for this community, somewhere between the currency is the application or the currency is the container, because in the end, developers want the currency to be the application, right? They want to just be able to code features into an application that's just updating and deploying. And how we get there, or do we actually, and I think some of the ways that we get there is some of the concepts you're talking about, Cornelia, right? Which is to make infrastructure environments that are immutable, declarative enough that they flow into the programming models that we have today. And yeah, I think that a lot of the unsolved problems are in that range, right? Lambdas will go too far, will be difficult to bring existing workloads to it, and so on. Even though perhaps that is a better world. But where we end up in terms of containers and platform as a service now, and how that needs to change programming models and frameworks, and really everything we're seeing on that front, I think that's very interesting.
Cornelia.
Looking for the unmute button. Yeah, I wanted to comment on that because I queued up my question to Jean, and then you went on and you talked about functions, which is, I was going to say, the first thing is that the currency is the container, and I am seeing a lot of developers kind of enamored with, still from the Docker heyday, enamored with the container being their currency. And you're right that they're now starting to move up the value chain, up the food chain, and saying functions are the right currency. Here's the key thing that I want to chime in on, is that I think, again, we still have two different personas here. And the different currency, I think there's different currencies that are viable for those two different personas. So when it comes to the developer who's creating some digital product that's going to be consumer facing, I completely agree with you that the currency needs to be something higher level, something like functions or apps like Cloud Foundry does. But when it comes to the people who are treating platform as a product, there in the past, the currency has definitely been the VMs, compute storage network. And that's where I see the currency evolving to containers, and not just containers, but actually pods, so multiple containers. So that's something that the Kubernetes community has really done an incredible job with, is the set of primitives that are available to the platform person is an up-leveling of infrastructure, but it's still fundamentally an infrastructure-esque currency. So it's pods, it's bindings, it's those types of things. And as Kelsey Hightower and Joe Beda have said very famously, that Kubernetes is not a platform in and of itself, it's a starting point. So it offers primitives with which you can create a platform for the other persona that's using it across the top.
Yeah, I just have to share one of the aha moments I had during Cornelia's talk, which was, in Kubernetes, what I thought was just one of the most inconvenient things ever was the sidecar, right? To connect to the Cloud SQL database in Google, right? You have to have this sidecar. To do logging, you have to attach a sidecar to the pod. And I didn't actually understand why until you had mentioned that this is a way to deal with cross-cutting concerns, right? And I might be distorting my memory a little bit here, but I mean, I think this was when you mentioned Rod Johnson and his work on Spring, right? That the ability to liberate developers and address cross-cutting concerns like logging, well, it was one of the primary impetuses why people just flocked to Spring, right, from J2E or whatever orthodoxical frameworks that were just so unsatisfying. And that was for me, that was one of the biggest aha moments of the conference.
Yeah, I think I mean, this is what's so interesting, right? Is that I actually think so. Having worked with AOP at the Java level, at the object-oriented programming level for so long, I actually think they may have found a better home. So they did find a good home in dependency injection frameworks and Spring. I actually think they might have a better home in sidecars, right? Because you want to add those concerns, those kinds of concerns, like logging, auditing, and security things. They might want to live in the currency that's closer to deployment. And so I think that is absolutely fascinating. And I think your point, Cornelia, around some of those concepts, again, from programming languages, working at that, I think this is just a fascinating point you're making around the currency for infrastructure being slightly different still and the problems that need to be solved. Because they all come out from VM to container, whereas developers just want to think container and up. So that is...
History doesn't repeat, but it rhymes. I love that. So, I guess one of the things I find so fascinating about this topic is that it's a combination of ivory tower theoretical thinking. We're talking about functional programming, and you look at the lineage of functional programming. It is lambda calculus. Church showed the unification of the Turing machine and lambda calculus, and then you have things like SRE, which is this is born out of the forge of the running the most important properties on the planet. So, Tom, could you talk a little bit about SRE? I mean, you've been in an SRE at Google. What do you think about? I think it's so exciting that SRE is appealing to so many people and being adopted by so many organizations, and it's at the forefront of Google Cloud as they go to market. What do you think is so appealing about SRE?
I think what's appealing feeling about SRE is it's sexy because it comes from Google. But on a more practical, technical level, SRE and DevOps are both using basically the same techniques and technologies with the same goals. They just were kind of created in parallel and often use different words for the same things. But SRE seems at Google, the transformation that a lot of people talk about happened a long time ago. So they're really focused more on advanced things like just the operations side. And if you think about what they're really doing in SRE, is they're looking at the theory of constraints. Where's the bottleneck, and how can we fix that? Now, in traditional IT, you're in a silo, so the answer is, well, how can we fix that with only changing the stuff that's here in our silo, which usually you can't find the best solution, but you make do. In the SRE model, you can reach across silos. So I like to think of it as you have the CI/CD pipeline, and the SREs take time to stand at the end of the pipeline and say, what are the operational problems that we're having? What's the constraints? What's the bottleneck? And fix that by reaching deep into the pipeline and saying, oh, we could fix that by staying in our silo. But if we reach outside of the silo, the fundamental problem is, this developer team isn't doing enough testing, or this team isn't doing enough, whatever, or something simple like their documentation isn't very good. And reaching deep into that pipeline and saying, how can we collaborate with that other team within our organization and either sit with them for a week and fix that testing or that documentation, or somehow collaborate with them to fix the problem so that it's not causing we remove those deep-seated problems so they're not causing problems in operations. And by doing that every day as just your MO, you end up getting more and more optimized operations to the point where your operations are higher quality, lower cost, all those good things.
And Tom, I really want to thank you for introducing me to the SRE concepts. It must have been 2012, and I felt like I got the sneak peek, before the SRE took the world by storm. I really am grateful for the lessons you taught me about how Google does things. Mick, you had some comments about SRE as well.
Oh, just quickly, I think there's just two key points I think Tom made. One is this theory of constraints approach, and the other one you made before, Tom, about how in traditional IT organizations you've got some kind of infrastructure problem. You're just going to add people to it, right? You're basically going to add additional resources and try to scale your operations that way. Whereas you've got a completely different mindset if you take this more product and SRE-oriented approach of not bringing more people to the work, but bringing work to these people who then solve the problems in a scalable way. And actually, again, it just goes back to treating the delivery pipeline as a product. And I think this is another kind of key important thread, and this relates to the project to product discussion, is if you don't treat these things as a product, you're not ever going to scale them the right ways, because you're not going to, as you said, Tom, you're not going to have an incentive in even the team structure to find a scalable solution, because you'll just be adding bodies and, again, a project-oriented PMO style.
I've worked at companies where communicating across silos was punished. I've worked at companies. I worked at a company. I won't say what website it was, but it was the operations team realized that we didn't have backups, and we had a lot of important data. And we said, well, we need to talk to the developers about how we could back up this data while the website's running. And we were told no. And so the solution we came up with, if we have to stay in our silo, our only choice is to shut down the website once a night, do the backups, and bring it back up. So it's going to be down for 20 minutes or half an hour every night. And managers said, that's okay, because the developers were saying, no, we have these specifications. We've written the code to our specifications. So, and the specifications didn't include live backups. So, and that's what we did for a couple of years before we finally had enough customers that weren't in the European and US East Coast time zone that someone started to say, hey, maybe this website should not be down for 20 minutes every day at 4 a.m. European time was fine, had been fine.
Awesome. Damon.
Yeah, I think what's interesting about SRE is I feel like many successful movements, people miss the point, right? I think if you think about what happened with Agile and with DevOps, people like to focus on the skills of the individual, like, oh, I'll have production access, or oh, I'll be able to use these kinds of tools, or whatnot. And you see what's going on with SRE. People fixate on the wrong things, right? I think they fixate on the observability, better observability monitoring, automation tools. Developers having, systems administrators having developer skills and working with developer tools and using an SDLC. I think those are all great and those are necessary like evolutions. But if you look at, and I think Google's pretty plain about this, what's the fundamental change with SRE? It's different between systems administration is really kind of, I guess, two things, maybe three things. One is the shared responsibility idea, right? So it's kind of like what Tom was talking about, being able to cross, get out of your swim lane, right? And be able to work with people in different areas. And that's really done through air budgets with consequences. This idea that we're going to set this SLO, right? Our service level objective, and agree to it between the business and the developers and the operations. And if we blow that air budget, the difference between the SLO and perfection, then there's real consequences, meaning that we have to stop whatever we're doing and swarm to the problem. And getting above that air, that SLO, or within our air budget limit, is the number one priority, not the old fashioned way, which is, hey, ops, you deal with this, you figure it out. Dev, we're going to keep stuff in the pipeline, so to speak, with new features. And then the second real fundamental difference is the idea of a toil limit, right? The idea of saying that, that there's work that's either toil work or it's engineering work. And I think the best way to describe it is work that we could have automated, we should have automated. It's repeatable. It's not adding enduring value to what we're doing, versus work that requires human ingenuity, the engineering work, and adds enduring value to our organization. And setting a limit and saying, as an organization, we're not going to accept more than 50% of our time being consumed by toil. That's like the Google threshold. Your mileage may vary. And actually saying, as an organization, we're going to respect that. We're going to self-regulate and figure out how to help those organizations where that balance is tipped and they have too much toil and not enough engineering work. And that's really it. It's kind of that fundamental shift in mindset and principles is just fundamentally a radically different way to run an operations organization. And I think that's the exciting and sexy part of SRE. And I love just seeing, big enterprise operations organizations confront those two realities, because the new automation tools and the new monitoring tools, they're like, oh yeah, that's good. Another generation. We're used to that. But when you talk about that air budgets with consequences and enforceable toil limits, that's changing the game.
Yeah, I would love to talk to Stephen Thorne from Google gave. And there was even another condition that I thought was great, was that in some conditions, that air budget, being very specific about what that service level objective is, allows for the relaxation of tolerances, so that he gave an example of where operations teams were working hours in the middle of the night trying to get something running. Well, it turns out it actually wasn't that important, so they just left it alone for a year. Right.
Like that example was, if something doesn't if people don't check back for whatever business reason, within 6 hours normally, and the cache or whatever fails, or it doesn't update, in 3 hours, and you're still ahead of the game, right? So why are we killing ourselves working all night to fix this? That's the idea of kind of having the acceptable business failure threshold being the SLO, and perfection, and anything between that SLO and perfection is actual budget. They call it the ERR, ERROR budget, that the organization across dev and ops can use together to advance the system, right? Or focus on other parts of the system that need more attention, as long as they're within those air budgets. It's radically different than how you think about, sort of operations penalty driven SLAs.
Yeah, and I just love the idea that, it really is a self-balancing system. It gives the construct to allow self-balancing. Cornelia, and any thoughts, comments on this one?
Yeah, I think I loved your point, Damon, about error budgets being a mechanism that formalizes the relationship between organizations. That was something that I just had an aha moment that I never realized. And it was only in the context of this conversation where Tom talked about being forbidden from having these cross-organization conversations. And then this formal model for saying, this is the way that we engage on that. I think that is just brilliant.
Yeah, it's subtle, but once it's same. I had the same experience. I finally kind of got it. I was like, oh wow, like that's the hotness, not the new tools or developer or system administrators have developer skills or that's cool, but that's evolutionary. This sort of new mindset and principles. That's to me, that's revolutionary.
Yep.
Anders, any comments on this?
I mean, I think it's we've definitely, I think, in the latter half of this steered a little bit more towards the I'm going to say academic a little bit. Functional programming. Not a lot of enterprise people are asking for that right now. And I did, my first programming language was Scheme as well, taught out of the first edition of the Sussmans and Abelson's book. So I love that. But that is, I think, less immediately relevant, quite frankly, to the enterprise than is all the other stuff that we talked about. Treat your pipeline as product. In fact, treat it, pipeline as code is something we've been, evangelizing and putting out there for a long time. And really, that should be the first thing that you really worry about in some sense, because you're not going to ship anything unless you have a pipeline. Could be just Bob in the corner with his laptop, but if that's your pipeline, that's your pipeline. And I think some of the really hard problems are still there to be solved. And I think those are the enterprise problems where we have this awesome new technology. We've got this Formula One engine that you couldn't believe how cool it is. 1.6 liters, 800 horsepower, all that kind of stuff. But you're driving this car today, and it's what brings you to work, back and forth every day very reliably. You can't just switch from one to the other, overnight. It doesn't work that way. And the things that we refer to as legacy are the things that keep the lights on and bring the money in, which we all realize that. And it's a very, very difficult and I think daunting proposition, quite frankly, for a lot of the enterprises out there when they look at what all the new greenfield stuff is and what they have today, which is bringing the money in. It's a big leap, and it's going to take a lot of work and quite a lot of time to do that. I mean, it is changing the engine and the tires on the car while you're driving down the highway at speed. So that's what I love about the kind of the shift in focus a little bit this year, is this notion that, this is an end-to-end problem, and we're not done until, kind of the laptop to live. If we don't help solve that problem, then what have we done? And so I think the practical focus and the academic focus, both of those are incredibly important. So.
Yeah, and I love the phrase from I got this from Dr. Sidney Decker last year at the DevOps Enterprise Summit. He said, the French philosopher Jean Lévi-Strauss, who said, "Is it a better tool to think with?" And I think all of these are exposing the better ways to think and do things. So I'm super excited about where this program track is going. So the announced speakers for this track are people on this call. We got Mick Kirsten, Cornelia Davis, Damon Edwards, Tom Limoncelli. Also, we have Charity Majors, who will be talking about what it's like to build a platform and use a platform and the surprising trade-offs that can result. Stephen, we have Gian Moff giving a talk about SRE, again, from Google. He is in Google SRE. We have Sean Norris from Charter Standard, which, again, I just listened to that talk. It was spectacular. I think just a great way to think about operations. John Rostarski from KeyBank, speaking about the way he is running operations at Key. I think we have John Willis speaking about how Kubernetes is the new Linux. All of these things I think are just really exciting, because I think it really paints the direction forward. So I'm very much looking forward to the conference, and thank you so much for the panelists for being here. This is a topic I just have found a newfound love for. So thank you, Cornelia, Damon, Mick, Tom, and of course, Anders and Sam. So let me turn it back over to Sam, and I hope to see you all at the DevOps Enterprise Summit.
Fantastic. Thank you, Gene. Thank you, everybody, for participating on today's program. So the reason we're doing this is because we do have a fantastic conference coming up, October 22nd through 24th. The DevOps Enterprise Summit is now going to be in Las Vegas. We have lots of room for all the folks who want to join us. We were sort of constrained in San Francisco, but we have lots of room now for everyone from the community who wants to make it. We're making it even easier for folks to get here. We've got discount pricing. If you use the code DevOps 300 at the checkout. You can register at devopsenterprise.io or events.itrevolution.com to get a $300 discount. So get them while they're there. This started on the 15th of August. So actually, I don't know that there's going to be that many tickets left, honestly. But go ahead and register today. We are excited to see everybody. Thank you, everybody on the panel, for joining us. It was really great seeing all of you. And Gene, I'll leave it to you to say goodbye.
Right on. Hey, thank you, everybody. And see you in the future webinars or at the conference. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Bye.